Wes Huff can be ruined if this Alex O'Connor video is true. Now, let me try to recap to make sense if you're just jumping into this reaction of a reaction of a reaction of a reaction. If you haven't been keeping up, Wes Huff went on the Joe Rogan podcast, massive opportunity. Millions of people have watched this podcast. And in the conversation, he talks about the great Isaiah scroll. And Wes Huff said it was word for word identical to a earlier manuscript that was found from the Middle Ages.
One of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Dead Sea Scrolls, Middle Ages, this is a huge development. So people have decided to go in and identify whether this was word for word the same. Now, Wes Huff has conceded that perhaps the language of word for word was not the most appropriate to use on a platform such as Joe Rogan.
And when he asks me how close it is to the modern Hebrew copies of Isaiah, I say that it is word for word identical to the later Masoretic text. This was admittedly a hyperbolic statement that I should have been much more careful on.
This then led to the likes of Dan McClellan and Alex O'Connor picking apart what Wes said, claiming that there are thousands of textual variants. Well, our very own Gavin Ortlund responded to this and said that most of these variants are spelling errors that are inconsequential to the overall narrative. He then cited a source that he believes Wes was perhaps thinking about to the word-for-word language. Alex O'Connor has now made a response video to a response video of Gavin Ortlund's and mentioned me as well, saying that Gavin Ortlund intentionally left out aspects from the quote. He also interviewed Dan McClellan, which maybe Alex doesn't know this, but so did I. And the stark contrast between what was said to Alex and what was said to me is very telling, but we'll come back to that in a minute. But have the stakes ever been this high before? You have Alex O'Connor, very smart, very bright, intellectual, against Wes Huff. We got Dan McClellan, Gavin Ortlund. I get roped into this situation even though Alex can't pronounce my name correctly.
Like Ruslan KD.
It's Ruslan, Alex. It's Ruslan. So is Wes Huff an omitter and a deceiver in withholding certain information from Joe Rogan? Is Gavin Ortlund, in his defense of Wes Huff, also omitting details that could be catastrophic to the Christian faith? Or is Alex O'Connor and the guest T platforms also omitting details to reinforce their own dogmas against Christianity and the reliability of the Bible? Or do all of these people just believe genuinely the things that they describe in these videos and we're maybe getting caught up in some of the semantics and discrepancies of language? So in this video, we're going to be looking at some of this. We're going to be looking at the discrepancies in Isaiah. We're going to be looking at what Dan McClellan said in my conversation with him. And we're going to be looking at a very potential critical mistake that Alex and his guests made at the end of their podcast that we cannot ignore. All right, but before we get into that, guys, my name is Ruslan. This channel exists to encourage, empower, and inspire you to live a life that blesses God. If you're new here, if you're not new here, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. There's a huge percentage of the people that watch this channel, unfortunately, are not subscribed. Okay, I just would like the record to show that this is not me responding on behalf of Gavin Ortlund. I'm sure he'll have his own response when he gets around to it. This is not me responding on behalf of Wes Huff. I'm pretty certain Wes will also respond to it when he gets around to it. Those brothers are busy. This is me responding on behalf of me, not on behalf of Christian YouTube. There's no need to hyper-generalize. And so I'm going to do my very best to be charitable. Alex has described himself as a non-resistant non-believer and has claimed that he wishes he could believe in God. But this situation seems to have taken a darker turn. It seems that Alex has gone back to his cosmic skeptic way of handling himself on YouTube with people of faith. Okay, so in the beginning of Alex O'Connor's video, he opens with Wes Huff claiming word for word the Isaiah manuscripts in question. And we've already conceded that. But yet, despite Wes making a video, making a statement, multiple people conceding that he probably shouldn't have said word for word, Alex continues to rehash this.
Since then, I've had a lot of responses, most notably from Gavin Ortlund, who I keep getting told has refuted me. So I thought we could take a look. In this video, we'll look at the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Great Isaiah Scroll, also known as 1Q Isaiah A. In a later part 2, I'll address the New Testament topics I covered, like Jesus' divinity, the dating of John, and so on. So let's get into it.
Okay, so let's open with Alex O'Connor having Dan McClellan on. And again, I don't know, maybe he had Dan McClellan on before I had my conversation with him, which was shot Wednesday, came out Friday. Maybe he had him on after. But listen to what Dan says and pay very close attention to how neither Dan nor Alex go on to explain their claim here in terms of how significant or insignificant this is.
It was biblical scholar Dan McClellan who pointed this out in his own video, so I spoke with him about where this number came from.
That is a widespread piece of misinformation, that the majority of these differences are spelling differences. And it's not the majority, it's not a minority. it's none. This list of 2,600 variants is found in volume 32 of a series called Discoveries in the Judean Desert, which is the official series for the publication of the critical editions of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I've worked for quite some time with 1Q Isaiah A, and I knew there are all kinds of variants. So I went and dug out my DJD 32 and counted up all the variants. There are 2,771 of them. And I don't remember any that were clear differences of just spelling. And so I went through the volume and found the editor's own description of what they were doing with the list of textual variants.
The editors clearly specify, as you can see, that this list of variants only counts those which differ, quote, in more than mere orthography or meaning-neutral morphology, though ambiguous cases are included. I want to make it clear, I made this mistake as well. I also thought that the variants were mostly spelling-related.
So notice that the claim here is there's 2,600 variants. Now, I also find it interesting that there's never an explanation of what these variants are in Alex O'Connor's video. Did they change the text? Did they change the story? Are these just misspellings? Well, they say they're not just spellings. Do these change the meaning in a significant way? Well, I guess that would depend on what you define as significant. But it's very interesting that when we looked at Dan's initial response to Wes, we found that his own screen grab showed variants that seemed extremely inconsequential. And then I'm going to get into what Dan said on my channel regarding the accuracy of these manuscripts. I have a massive update for you. I'm sure by this point, you've heard about the Blessed God Summit happening March 27th, 28th, 29th here in beautiful Carlsbad, California. But we've heard your requests. We've conceded to your demand. There are virtual tickets that are now available for the Blessed God Summit, so you can access it from anywhere in the world, as well as access to the replays. And for those of you guys that are looking for something extra, we're also offering a virtual ticket and an exclusive Bless God Summit merch bundle. There's some amazing art and some exclusive pieces done by our friend Josh Nadeau from Sword and Pencil that you have to check out. So join us online for the virtual event and experience some sessions from my favorite podcasters, pastors, and performers. We have a stacked lineup. I'm talking about Preston Perry, Dr. Sean McDowell, Inspiring Philosophy. What do you mean? Lila Rose, Alan Parr and his wife Jen Parr. We even have Nate Sala from Wise Disciple, Gavin Ortland, David Wood, Avery from God Logic Apologetics. And on the pastoral side, we have my friend Daniel Golding, Pastor Ed Newton from CBC in San Antonio, and my personal pastor from Rhythm Church, Pastor Jeff Moores and his wife Erin Moores. You won't want to miss out from amazing performances from America's Got Talent winner Dustin Savella, Billboard charting hip-hop artist John Keith and Miles Minnick, and as seen on Jordan Peterson's We Who Wrestle with God tour, Dirt Poor Robbins. And we're still finalizing a few more speakers. So head over to blessgod.shop, get your virtual ticket now, and you can get yourself a bundle with some of the exclusive merch as well. I'll see you over there, all right? Peace. So here is from Dan's original video, some of these variants, okay? Now they're underlined, and if you look closely, it says the word and, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This needs to be about a dozen variants, and 5 of those variants is the word and. Now, we all have to come to our own conclusion. These variants that are significant, are these significant variants if the word and is in here 5 times, but the other words are things like whom, look at him? Are these significant variants? Are these significant things that change the text, change the meaning of the text, change the application of the text, change anything about the reliability of the scripture? I think people have to do their own diligence and work through that. But these are the type of variants that Dan himself highlights. These are the type of variants that no one goes on to explain in any of these videos. And I would love for Dan or Alex to go and tell us, how does this change the actual meaning of the passage? How different is this? And how does it change Christianity? How does it change any essential beliefs? Dan has said on my channel that it doesn't change any essential beliefs because he believes the essential beliefs come after the Bible has already been around and people come to their own conclusions on doctrine. So the question comes down to, how similar are these manuscripts with what we have today? Now, Alex O'Connor in this video says they're about 93%. Dan McClellan's mentor, Peter Flint, in the video that Dan himself posted, a correction and apology, says 99%.
The differences are marked in yellow. There's about 10 or 11 differences. Oh dear. Does this mean that God's word is riddled with mistakes? And scholars do not count those as real differences. If you take away the spelling, we only have one difference. So the point is, the Dead Sea Scrolls confirm that your Bible is 99% accurate.
So we got Peter Flint, Dan's mentor saying 99% accurate. Dan's response to this is, well, Peter Flint privately only believed 95% was accurate, but publicly in a religious setting where he was encouraging people to trust their Bible, he would say 99%. Alex and Dan both say they feel like the manuscripts are about 93% the same. Now let's get into how significant was this discovery of these manuscripts. I asked Dan this in my conversation with him, which again, I don't know when this was shot. So notice carefully the contrast in tone between what Dan said here, and me and him disagreed on a lot, and what he said to Alex O'Connor.
So the characterization of the accuracy of the manuscripts as shocking is, this is not something that we can demonstrate empirically. That's just a characterization. That's a matter of opinion. It's a judgment call.
Sure.
I absolutely agree that it demonstrates a high degree of care and concern for the accurate transmission of these manuscripts. Nobody doubts that. Nobody argues with that. However, I do disagree with the notion that this shocked scholars.
So Dan McLennan, in our conversation, said no one doubts the accuracy of these manuscripts. He just didn't like the language, word for word, and shocking. But as we go deeper into this conversation, listen to what he concedes was significant about this discovery.
Because I've worked with many of the scholars who have worked on this. Do they appreciate the accuracy? 100%. Were they shocked by it? I don't know anybody who was like, wow, that was unexpected. I was shocked by that.
So here I go on to ask Dan, were there any scholars that were excited that maybe the word shocked was inappropriate according to Dan and according to Alex? But were there any scholars that were excited about it? Check out Dan's response. Were there any, could we use the word, again, I don't mean to get super meticulous, but were there any scholars that were excited, maybe we don't use the word shocked, but excited, affirmed, celebratory that there's so much consistency? Because everything you're saying to me, Dan, is like, that's new, that's exciting for me. Is it possible that there's been any scholars that were celebratory, excited, maybe the word shocked is too much, that could have been what Wes was implying when he was talking to Joe Rogan? And I would agree with you that perhaps the word for word, and I said that in my very initial comment, could he have been more careful with his language? Sure. But were there any folks that could have been excited about these developments?
I think absolutely. They're probably, like, excitement is one thing. This is one of the most incredible archaeological discoveries of the modern world. Has entirely revolutionized our understanding of the textual transmission of the Bible, even our understanding of the development of the Hebrew language. There are so many things that this discovery does that changes that, this was a sea change for the study of the Bible. So excited, ecstatic, absolutely. But I don't think shocked is a good way to characterize how scholars responded to being made aware of the proximity, the textual proximity of 1Q Isaiah A to the Masoretic text.
So had he said to Joe Rogan, hey, the Isaiah scrolls are 92.7% identical, and some scholars are excited in terms of how much consistency there is between these manuscripts that are a big time away, would you have been as intentional to refute Wes's claim there? Had he phrased it that way?
No. If he had said something that was closer to, even if he said it's something like 99%.
So notice, Dan said he wouldn't have had a problem if Wes would have said 99% the same. And he also said this is one of the greatest archaeological discoveries.
This is one of the most incredible archaeological discoveries of the modern world.
And people were excited and celebratory. And he would have been okay if Wes would have said 99% the same. So what are we splitting hairs over? Are we being myopic in our need to be hyper literal as if Wes is a walking, talking encyclopedia in the middle of a 3-hour conversation in a high pressure environment? Perhaps we should give Wes a little bit of grace. Perhaps we should say, hey, he acknowledged. Word for word probably wasn't the best way to describe that, but goodness gracious, Dan is saying he wouldn't have had a problem if Wes would have said 99% the same. So this is where you, as the watcher, need to think, well, is this a reasonable thing to be fussy and upset about? Or is this being nitpicky for no reason? Now, Alex O'Connor goes on to end his video in this way, and I think here is where him and his guests make a pretty critical mistake. Watch this.
Isn't it still just amazing to find a possibly 92.5% fidelity between the two texts? Remember,
the overwhelming agreement between the Isaiah scroll and the later Masoretic text is shocking, despite orthographic and minor scribal differences.
Isn't it still a wow moment?
Rogan's reaction to the correction of wording should be exactly the same. It is a wow moment.
Isn't it still just amazing and unheard of for an ancient text to be so well preserved?
But here's the thing. There's nothing special about 1Q Isaiah A or any biblical manuscripts in terms of their fidelity or how close they are to later copies of the Old Testament. You could do the same thing with manuscripts of pretty much anything from antiquity.
Okay, now this is Kip Davis. Kip Davis is someone who Alex thought would be a good idea to call into this conversation. Kip Davis also made a response towards myself, Wes Huff, Gavin Ortlund, because he is a textual critic, scholar of sorts, and he titled the video, "Get Off My Lawn," okay? As in, I, as a Christian creator, have no right to get on his lawn and speak about these things because this is beyond my area of expertise. Very boomer-like behavior, if you ask me, Kip. Now, I've never presented myself as an expert. I've actually never even called myself an apologist. I'm just a guy on YouTube that finds these conversations interesting, and I'm willing to talk to guys like Dan McClellan and ask the clarifying questions. This "get off my lawn" thing comes off very elitist, Kip. But that wasn't his biggest mistake. No, his biggest mistake is what he goes on to say about these other books from antiquity and how the Bible is not unique, and compares it to something much more sinister. So I decided to reach out to my friend Avery from God Logic Apologetics to discuss this point here made by Alex and Kip Davis. All right, so I'm going to play you what Kip Davis said, and then you just give me your thoughts and the claims they made here about the Quran.
There's nothing special about 1Q Isaiah A or any biblical manuscripts in terms of their fidelity or how close they are to later copies of the Old Testament. You could do the same thing with manuscripts of pretty much anything from antiquity. So why are we so shocked and so excited when the Bible, when biblical manuscripts basically just look like all other ancient manuscripts?
That's why, by the way, it would be amazing if the Isaiah scroll was different from other texts in being actually word for word with no variants.
Yeah, and if you want something that approaches that kind of textual fidelity, we have, manuscripts for that too. They just all happen to be manuscripts of the Quran. Now, there are reasons why that is the case that are not miraculous either. It's just the nature of how the Qumran was transmitted and preserved, which is quite different. The circumstances behind that are quite different from anything in the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament or the Greco-Roman world. But, that's where those manuscripts are.
And this brought to mind an interesting hypothetical.
Now, so before we get into his Quran and how that's been preserved, I would love for you to explain that to us. But his claim here is that there's nothing significant, there's nothing special, there's nothing to see here. There's nothing to see here about the Bible. It's not unique. Any thoughts on that?
If that's the case, then he's just destroyed, all of what we know about ancient characters in history, Alexander the Great, Caesar, all these guys. The New Testament documents are special because of how early they are and close to the time they are, the attestation that they have for the historicity of Jesus. That's what makes them so special. When it comes to all these other figures, their testimonies and stories don't come until centuries and centuries later. One, you have the first century documents, which we don't have the originals, but we have copies of these that are within the second century. That's early if you're talking about the historical method. So if he's saying there's nothing special about that, he just destroyed all of history of what we know.
Yeah. But now, to be fair to Kip, he said, he was talking about Isaiah here, right? So is the Isaiah manuscripts different? Because I think hopefully he would concede that the New Testament is very unique in this sense about the life of Jesus. It's written within decades, where others are written hundreds of years later about Alexander the Great, as you point out. But does he have any validity to how Isaiah is nothing special, nothing to see here?
No, the reason why the Isaiah scroll is special is because of the prophecy that it contains. In Isaiah, you literally have the gospel. It's actually one of the nicknames for Isaiah. It's the fifth gospel. Because you have an entire chapter, you have Isaiah 53. Well, really, it starts in 52, the suffering servant passages that predicts in detail what's happening to the suffering servant. He's going to be marred beyond human resemblance. He's going to be rejected by his own people. He's going to sprinkle many nations with his blood. He's going to bear the sins of many, be counted with the transgressions, buried with the rich man in his death, led to the lamb of the slaughter, but be silent, not fight back, not resist. And this is exactly what you have in the story of Jesus in the gospel. And with this Isaiah scroll, that's at least around 200 years prior to the birth of Jesus. So if this Isaiah scroll is as legit as we know it is, then we have God's fingerprint, which is prophecy. We literally have historical evidence of God's prophecy and revelation about the Messiah.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so what do you make of this entire Well, if you want to look at better preservation, we could start talking about other books like the Quran, but we don't want to go there because that's a different thing. It seems a bit disingenuous to me. I don't mean to ascribe ill intent to then omit why the Quran is quote unquote more preserved. And I don't know if they did this on purpose or not, or maybe they were going to describe it in a different video, but they're going really hard at this Isaiah. And then they kind of like, well, the Quran is even more preserved, but then they don't really give us any explanation. This is something you've debated countless times with really, Muslim, I don't know what you call them, apologist about this exact issue, the preservation of the Quran. Give us a little bit more context and what's the difference there?
Well, it's interesting that because he said something, Ruslan. He said that the formation of the Quran and its preservation of the text had a different method than when it comes to the Hebrew scriptures, which he's actually correct. With the Hebrew scriptures, and this is important, you don't have a singular authority deciding what goes in or goes out, right? You don't have one person that's in charge or controlling the manuscripts, deciding what is good and what is not, because that would allow for, some bias on his side, what he thinks is right, So we don't have that with the Hebrew scriptures, but in Islam, you literally have one man, Uthman, who was one of the leaders after Muhammad's death. He decided what manuscripts were good, what wasn't, and he actually had other manuscripts of the Quran that disagreed with his copy that he had remade. He had them burned. And you'll find this in the source of Sahih Bukhari, which is one of the authentic, historical narrations and sources when it comes to Islamic history. Sahih Bukhari is like right under the Quran. So they can't deny this. In Sahih Bukhari, you have Uthman rewriting the Quran in what they call a perfect copy, and then having the other manuscripts, it says, whether in fragmentary or whole copies, be burned. Now imagine this. Imagine, Ruslan, what they would say if we, according to our Bible, had Paul or Peter or Constantine control the transmission of the Bible, control what goes in and goes out, and then they burn the rest. Imagine if that was part of our history.
That would be huge in terms of it being a black eye. And so, what do you make of this? Like he's accurate in that it was different, but yet there seems to be an omission of how different it really was, and that it's not in the least exciting. If anything, it just validates the preservation of Scripture as, in my opinion, being more trustworthy, and that there wasn't this singular force that decided what went in and went out.
100%. Ruslan, it's kind of like he took a jab at the Bible and then tried to like give a praise to the Quran in a way. And maybe he might be, ignorant on the subject. Maybe not, he doesn't know this. And he's just going based off of, the usual trope from the Muslims. Word for word, letter for letter, the Quran is the same, been preserved all the way back to Muhammad's time. Muslims memorize it. We have everything. It's been preserved. The only book in the world that's been perfectly preserved, letter for letter, word for word. Now, if this is the case, now catch this. You have Uthman, as I just said, who had other manuscripts burnt, and they rewrote what they called a perfect copy of the Quran and passed that out to the different tribes within Islam, right? So then, if that's the case, you would think that would eliminate any differences or eliminate any confusion when it comes to the Quran, since it was copied in a perfect copy under the rule of Uthman, who can watch all of this, right? Problem solved. So then why in the world do we find different Arabic Qurans out there? You have the Huff's Quran, which is the most famous. This one was standardized in 1924 in Cairo. This is when this actually particular Arabic version of the Quran became the standard in the most popular Muslim world. So you have the Huff's Quran, which is the most popular. Then you have the Warsh Quran. These are all Arabic Qurans, by the way. Warsh Quran, Huff's Quran, Duri, Ibn Kathir, Kalun, and Al-Kasai, and Al-Hamza. You have these are the 7 readings of the Quran. There's more, but these are just 7 I could just name off the top of my head that are different Arabic versions of the Quran, and they differ in many places. Where, and I'm not talking about small things. I'm talking about some say that Allah gets surprised, where the other verse says Muhammad got surprised. So which one is it? Was Allah the one that was surprised, their God, or was Muhammad the one that was surprised? It changes the entire context, right? So they have real meaningful variants in their Quran. Why in the world does this exist when Uthman had burned the manuscripts and made one perfect copy? That should have solved the problem. But
so
we still have
even their parallel of the Quran and books from antiquity, which again, hundreds of years later, being more preserved or more spectacularly preserved with different methods, even that illustration implodes on itself. It sounds like
it's a terrible argument. It backfires to say something like it's a dangerous claim. It's dangerous. Well, I'm glad that we're honest with our sources and our texts. We have no problem acknowledging textual variants and different manuscripts, and we compare and we come to the truth, and we have it all. None of it is hidden. I'm glad that we're honest with this stuff, and we don't make this claim that Bible preservation has to be word for word, letter for letter the same. We acknowledge that it was transmitted through men. God inspired men to write the scriptures, and there can be textual variants while the message is conveyed and the gospel is unchanged. No problem there. It's a dangerous thing to say of a text of antiquity that it's been perfectly preserved word for word, letter for letter. That doesn't exist. That's silly. And so for them to make this claim, they put themselves in a hole that they can't climb out of unless they're going to be honest with it.
Yeah, that's good. Let me play the last little bit of Alex's video and see if you got anything else to add to this.
Imagine for a moment that a Muslim went on Joe Rogan and claimed that they'd found some 1,000-year-old Quran that was word for word identical with the Quran we have today. And imagine this really impressed Joe Rogan as well. If it then transpired that there were in fact thousands of textual variants in that Quran, including entire verses missing altogether, how charitable do you think the Christian community would be to that Muslim's mistake? Especially if it also transpired that he made this mistake because he misremembered a quote about the wrong document. That's a genuine question. Anyway, I want to note that I don't make these arguments in some attempt to validate atheism. I do not think that variants in the Isaiah scroll disprove Christianity, or even mean that we can't trust the book of Isaiah in a broad sense. I was simply calling out Wes Huff for mistakenly saying that the two texts are word for word identical, and I'm now pointing out some mistakes that I think I found in some of the responses that I've received.
Well, at least he's being honest that textual variants don't disprove the Isaiah scroll, or doesn't mean that Christianity is false or that this stuff is untrustworthy. I'm glad he's able to be honest and admit that. We're all human, and even Wes Huff, he came out, he acknowledged his mistake, and that's okay. It happens. As long as we're humble about it and we can admit things, that's just fine. But to say that there's nothing special about the Isaiah scroll it's almost like something that you're allowing something purposely to go over your head. Because as an atheist, when it comes, you have to be serious with this. Even as an atheist, you have to come up with the explanation. Why in the world do we see the crucifixion of Jesus in a text almost 200 years before he was born? Explain that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Avery, I'm looking forward to having you at the Bless God Summit, March 27th, 28th, 29th. We'll be doing a powwow of different Christian YouTubers and all you apologists sharing your views on these different things. So thank you, and I can't wait to be with you in person, brother.
Thanks for having me, man. God bless you, bro.
Now, I don't know why Alex and Kip left all of this out, but some may say that this was kind of a lie of omission. They didn't tell the full context of why the Quran was so wonderfully preserved, or that there's still 7 variants of it out today. But you know what I wouldn't do? I wouldn't ascribe ill intent. I wouldn't say that they're lying or that they're omitting things intentionally to make a better argument for atheism or for Kip's deconverted faith. I wouldn't do any of that. I would just say, hey, they probably genuinely believe the things that they're saying, even though I think they're genuinely wrong, very wrong. And so you notice that when we leaned in and picked apart the claim that both Kip and Alex made, how nonsensical it really sounded. You notice how when we got super nitpicky, their position seemed more preposterous and even potentially deceptive. And according to my friend God Logic, who constantly works with folks in the Muslim community, he even described it as dangerous. But I'm not ascribing intent or ill motive. just interesting that that was left out. So I don't know why Alex and Kip and Dan are being so nitpicky about this. I'm also curious why Alex isn't going after all the things that Joe Rogan himself said about atheism on that podcast with Wes Huff. Why zone in on this? In another video, we'll also look at Dr. Sean McDowell and William Lane Craig rebutting some of Alex's point about Jesus never claiming to be God. But the question still remains, why did Alex decide to pick this fight with Wes Huff? Well, I'm not sure. But perhaps it's connected to the time where Wes Huff actually chimed in on Alex's terrible use and argument for why the Gospel of Thomas may be reliable. We'll have that pinned over here. It's from a few months ago, right before Wes Huff blew up. And if you want to see my full, unedited conversation with Dan McClellan, we'll have this over here. All right? I'll see you over there. Peace.